Today is election day, and my guest and I have both voted already, and my guest serves on the Athens City Council, and I began voting in 1960 when I was 30 years old, and my first vote was for John F. Kennedy. Now, since then, I've always voted in the primary as well as the general election. And, but I really didn't understand the local elections until I was 42 years old, when I decided to run for Congress on a fluke. And I ran in southeast Ohio in 12 counties. And I visited 12 counties, and I soon learned that there was a difference between the clerk of courts and the county commissioner. And I'm afraid our students know less about it than I knew. So that election of 1972 was an experiment which failed, but it did make me a better teacher of history, because history is past politics, and present politics will become history. That's an old slogan that was repeated again and again in most of my classes. And I learned a lot about 12 counties, not too much about the 88 counties, but I did learn that there were a total of 88. And the first duty of a teacher then is to know something about American history. And my first duty was to explain that democracy was better than communism and better than fascism, and that Christianity was co-equal with the Jewish religion, but all other religions are somewhat alien, because both the Jews and the Christians have the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments as a basic standard of right and wrong. Since 2016, I'm jumping the gun here. We're still in 2015, and in 2016, the issue will be, is American constitutional system and the two-party system going to survive in the United States? Because I think there is evidence of decay. Anyway, our topic today is the Soviet-U.S. arms race from 1972 to Ronald Reagan's administration, and hopefully we'll get up to 1983. And my guest is Jeff Risner, who is a member of the City Council, as I've said, but he's also an expert on computers, which tells us something about the nuclear arms race. And I've learned a lot from his discussions. And I am a retired historian from Ohio University, and this is the Athens Speakout number 351. So the last week, we were supposed to talk about Ronald Reagan and the arms race, but we got into so many earlier issues that we never did get to 1980. But we did point out that the Korean War was a real war, 1950 to 53, and had very little to do with the so-called Cold War, and that both Truman and Stalin, neither of them used the atomic bomb in Korea because there were no reasonable targets there. And Eisenhower was a little slow to learn the problems of the nuclear weapon. But in his last 2 years, 1959, 1960, he decided that the mad missile policy was indeed mad, and he gave a very famous speech on the military-industrial complex and told the voters, why don't you put the money into schools and hospitals and save this big waste on nuclear weapons? So that was followed by John Kennedy, who in 1963 signed the first limitation treaty, the Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty, and then that was followed by a second nuclear limitation treaty sponsored by the United Nations General Assembly, called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It began in 1970, and they now have about 190 countries who have signed this. So then that led to a third treaty by Nixon. Nixon signed the ABM Treaty in May of 1972, the second arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union. And that limited the arms race to one ABM system, one anti-ballistic missile launcher, and it stopped the arms race in space, and it gave both the Soviet Union and the United States more time to negotiate further limitation treaties. And that was about where we ended. And I want to start out with a new statement, a statistical summary of where the arms race is today. This was published in the Athens Messenger a couple of weeks ago. And we now have statistics about the 9 nuclear powers. And there are a total of 16,593 nuclear warheads in the world. And the Stockholm Initiative Research Institute keeps track of these. And the United States is so-called number one, whatever that might mean, with 7,386 nuclear warheads. Russia has about 8,000 warheads. Great Britain has 225. France has 500. And they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty a little later, in 1992. They both signed together in the Clinton administration, in the Bush administration, when both Clinton and the first Bush, 41, were talking about hope for further disarmament. And then after that, we got into some trouble. India got into the race, and we now have 110 nuclear warheads in India. Pakistan, 120. I don't know what they're going to do with those 10 extras. And then we have Israel with officially 80, and some say it's really 110 because Israel is very cautious about publishing its information. And last comes North Korea with 8 weapons. That is the nuclear stockpile situation. Now, going back to 1972 and Kissinger's ABM Treaty, we have statistics there as of 1972. And the situation in 1972, when Kissinger signed the ABM Treaty in May, the United States then had 5,000 nuclear warheads, and the Soviet Union was behind with 2,100 warheads. And the mass media and the White House didn't trust one another, and the congressional hawks were always looking at these false numbers. What difference does it make whether the United States has more warheads than the Soviet Union? It's as if a farmer was starving to death and he had a bushel of beans, and one farmer had 5,800 beans, and the other farmer only had 2,100 beans, but they were both on starvation. Neither one of them, by counting these beans, are going to survive very much. Well, that's really the situation of the false arms race. Anyway, Brezhnev and Kissinger made some kind of a gesture in at least limiting it with the ABM. And at that time, on the launches in 1972, when Nixon retired in his second term, the United States had 3,230 launches, and Brezhnev had 3,090, almost parity. But again, what difference does it make in a nuclear war, whether it's 2 days, 3 days, 30 days? By 30 days, as Carl Sagan said, you will have a nuclear winter, and it doesn't make any difference that Vladivostok will survive a few extra days compared to Arizona. It'll cover the whole Earth. That is, if you believe Carl Sagan. Mm-hmm. And I think Carl Sagan is probably right, although I don't want to experiment with it. Okay, I think we have one more statement, and then we'll get on to the question. Back to the main arms race, in May of '72, Nixon and Brezhnev met only 2 days to sign the ABM treaty, but that came after a long talk of nuclear experts between the Soviet nuclear experts and the American nuclear experts that began in November of 1969. When Kissinger first came in there, he was the nuclear expert for Nixon. And those two expert committees fiddled around with the bean count, you know. How many submarines you got? How many bombers do you have? And where can they be delivered? And so forth and so on. So Nixon and Brezhnev just had to sign a big technical piece of paper, and they didn't have to read it very much. It was all worked out by the technologists. Anyway, in '72 then, October '72, Nixon followed up the Moscow deal with his greater breakthrough publicity-wise, with Nixon and Kissinger meeting Mao Zedong at Beijing and recognizing that Beijing is now a great power and could compete with Russia, at least in economics and capitalism, and probably in population. So the Soviet Army is #1 at 800 yards, but they have no ambition to catch up to the Americans and the Russians in nuclear bombs. Anyway, Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 in a great hope, and Kissinger and Carter signed in Vienna the second SALT Treaty in 1978. But unlike the ABM, there was no follow-up because Carter got into some difficulties in Iraq, in Iran, in Afghanistan, and Israel. And Brezhnev said, no, I can't get involved in all of that. And he wouldn't follow through with a nuclear arms agreement because Carter was a little bit too naive. He was too idealistic. Mm-hmm. He put too many issues on the table.
Right.
And
well, he put the Russian invasion of Afghanistan on the table.
That was one thing.
Which he shouldn't have. That's a separate thing.
That's right. Now, Kissinger kept everything in a box.
That's right.
When he went to see Brezhnev, he didn't say anything about going to Beijing.
Well, we wouldn't even Carter boycotted the Russian Olympics because of that.
Yeah.
Just nonsensical things. If you want to deal with that issue, deal with it, but other issues, leave it alone.
And then he got talking about China, and détente with China means, well, we're going to do more business. They're going to go capitalistic. Mm-hmm. The longer he talked about Deng Xiaoping, the more suspicious Brezhnev becomes. So he put too many issues on the table. Yeah. And then Israel was another straw that broke the camel's hump. Mm-hmm. Carter, since he knew something about the Old Testament, said, well, I can negotiate a peace treaty. Well, Zionists don't take the Old Testament too seriously. But that was a disillusion of Carter over the long run. Mm. Okay, so I guess we can get now to... no, I guess I still have a little more to say about... Oh, I may have a couple. You have anything more to say about Brezhnev and SALT I and... Carter's simplicity and the ABM treaty?
Well, I think SALT I was a good start there.
Good start.
It was.
But he couldn't keep the ball rolling.
No, when they got to the SALT II, that's when things started falling apart. And
yeah, well, one of the problems was Zbigniew Brzezinski and the CIA. Mm-hmm. And Zbrzynski was a Polish ethnic, and he was a dogmatic anti-communist.
Yeah.
And William Casey was another problem, also a dogmatic anti-communist.
Right.
And Zabriskie started talking to Pope John Paul II
Yeah.
and started visiting Poland. That didn't go over well with Brezhnev.
No. They got solidarity going, but that didn't do anything for nuclear disarmament.
Right. So Israel and Poland, there were just too many issues on the table.
Right.
And but now you see, Jimmy Carter needed Brezhnev because in the Democratic Party at home, he needed to have Brezhnev and Casey to get the Catholic vote because the Cold War was still on the table, and the mass media still believed that Soviet Union is the major enemy, and that's this detente was only an experiment. So I guess that's the problem of Jimmy Carter's.
Right. Well, the Afghan invasion didn't help matters either.
No, the Afghan. Well, of course, he lost the hostages. That was the straw that broke,
that
broke the camel's hump.
Yeah, that was horribly mishandled.
Yeah, right. So anyway, Brezhnev then was a hardliner, and when Reagan came to power, Brezhnev was still there. So nothing was done for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, he was still alive.
Yep, and Reagan was talking about winning the Cold War. So there had to be some kind of a breakthrough at some point. So I guess we will get to the question for Steve. Jeff, right. That's right. Sorry about that. Happens when you're 85.
Happens to me all the time.
Yeah. Well, anyway. What was the United States and Soviet nuclear war count as of 1982 when Ronald Reagan's second year and they took statistics on this problem? Do you have any figures on that, or do you want me to?
I don't have any right here.
Okay, well, I have some.
I know it wasn't parity by that time. I think by that time
it was almost parity.
The Russians were pulling ahead, but again, what does that mean?
Well, okay. It shows that the United States kept building since Nixon. And by that time, the United States had 11,000 nuclear warheads, twice as many as Nixon, on a 10-year period. And then if you go over to Brezhnev's side, he was up to 10,000. He was building them faster on a rate than the United States was.
Right.
But they were still, well, they almost reached parity. It was 11,000 versus 10,000.
Yeah.
By that time, almost parity. This might give the bean counters a little hope in the psychologists, but it makes no difference to me and you, I don't think.
Not a whole lot. I mean, you drop 10,000 atomic bombs on a country. I'm trying to think where in all of the Soviet Union, as large as it was, you know, there's 1/8 of the total landmass of the world. But even then, there's.
Well, they had about 200 cities that were worth some kind of a target.
Okay, so you take 200 cities and you divide that into 10,000, and that's 50 bombs apiece? I mean, you blow it up 50 times over?
Yeah.
Is that the point?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's one point. But you see, Sagan's argument is you only need 6 bombs. You take them up in the stratosphere in the winter. You blow out the ionosphere, and then it starts to snow.
Well,
and all of the heating devices in America will go dead because electricity goes dead.
Yeah,
so the furnaces won't go on.
Yeah.
The trucks won't deliver, and they'll freeze to death and starve to death in 36 days.
Yeah, a nuclear pulse. Yeah. What you're talking about is an electromagnetic pulse.
Yeah, that's it.
And I know during the early 1960s, the United States experimented with that quite a bit, and that's why before the Test Ban Treaty, there were all these wonderful aurora borealis being seen in the summer.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have that in the summer, you know. And there were, I mean, even here in Ohio, we were seeing them.
Is that right?
That was because they were ionizing the upper atmosphere, and they were testing the idea. Well, could that happen? And the results were pretty ambivalent. Yeah, theoretically you could, but the weapon, the device would have to be extremely powerful. I mean, it would be just one hell of a hydrogen bomb to throw up in the atmosphere to do that.
Yeah. 6 wouldn't do it.
And then the other other problem would be, it's like germ warfare. You drop a plague on a city, and then the wind carries it around. It may blow back on you.
That's right.
Okay, so the problem with that was, if you did it, my country could be affected by it too. There would be no way to limit it. Once it got going, it would just simply go.
That's what happened at Chernobyl. It started to blow up to Sweden, and
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why the Ukraine in that area is uninhabitable.
well, I'm glad the Ukrainians gave up on the bomb. That was a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
It was a hard lesson. Well, anyway, on these figures, if you want to look at the 1982 launch account, the United States had 2,050, and that really was close to parity. Soviet Union was now ahead with 2,400.
Right.
Okay, but that's not going to be decisive.
No, not really. Of course, one of the problems that they were having, this is under when Melvin Laird was Secretary of Defense. The United States had what they called the triad system, where we had nuclear weapons and submarines and bombers and missiles.
Right.
Well, our submarine fleet was, modern, and a nuclear submarine is virtually undetectable. It's out there and it fires missiles, and that's it. Our bomber fleet was getting older. B-52s. I mean, you now had men who were older than the airplane were flying. but I mean, they were still flying. I mean, they could still do the job, but they were slow and would probably get shot down. Probably not very many of our bombers would ever get through the.
Yeah, that was the film of the great Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove. Though actually, there was a far more accurate film. I mean, Dr. Strangelove was played for laughs. Technically, it left a lot to be desired. The other film that came out at the same time that didn't get the praise that Kubrick got was Failsafe.
I saw that too.
And Failsafe really is by far the most frightening film of the two, because it really is.
It's more technology.
It's technically extremely accurate.
Yeah.
And when they said, okay, if we sent this many bombers into the Soviet Union, we're going to lose this many, but this many will get through. They will get to their target, and they will obliterate Moscow. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And when you hear that in those type of tones, then you realize that this really is serious. They're playing.
Now, did Failsafe come out after?
No, it came out about the same time.
Same time.
Yeah. But
that had
Strangelove was funny, and people got a big kick out of Peter Sellers, and and it took the edge off the nightmare.
I see. You were more the technologist.
Yeah, I looked at.
I was this historian having fun.
Yeah. Failsafe to me was the one that really was the most terrifying, because it showed this is.
And that gets into this idea of accidental war.
Yeah.
The computers, launch on computers.
Mm-hmm. Something could happen, and well, then that's it. They're on their way. Well, anyway, what I was trying to get to with Melvin Laird was it was our land-based missile systems that were now obsolete. We had these old Atlas and Titan missile silos scattered all over Montana and Iowa and Kansas and places like that. And they were extremely vulnerable.
Sure.
They were not buried very deep. It wouldn't take anything to knock one out. I mean, you can park a truck on top of one, and that would put it out of commission. So they were trying to come up with all kinds of exotic ways, and one way was, well, we'll put them on trains. Remember that? We're going to.
Oh, yeah.
We'll shuffle them around.
Yeah.
They'll never
Utah said no.
Right, we don't want that. And then they got the bright idea, well, we'll have this thing called dense pack.
Never heard of that.
Well, dense pack, and technically it's extremely feasible, is that you don't scatter your weapons around at all. No, you put them in just one small area, maybe a few square miles by a few square miles. You put all of them there. And the problem now is for the attacker is, if I launch more than one atomic weapon at this target, it will destroy all the other incoming missiles.
Yeah.
It's what they call fratricide. See, if unlike dynamite, if I have a stick of dynamite here and a stick of dynamite there, and I detonate this stick of dynamite, it will detonate this stick of dynamite. So I'll have two explosions.
Yeah.
If I have an atomic bomb here, an atomic bomb there, and I explode this one will be totally destroyed. It'll never detonate. it will have no influence on the other. It won't be used.
Right.
It's gone.
Yeah.
So you don't want all these missiles coming in at the same time. So you're going to have to space them 1, and then 2, and 3. If you have to do that, all these missiles that I have on the ground here can fire. They'll be in the air.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant idea.
A brilliant idea for Teller, the madman.
Exactly. But the problem is it's extremely expensive. I mean, and the other thing is you have to realize is that I have to be at such a state of readiness that as soon as I detect that one missile coming in, all these have to go.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like I got them scattered all over the place and I can fire this one here and this one in Montana there. I could have some time to see if the missile coming in really is a missile and not something else. And that was one of the reasons why they said, no, we can't go with this. No, we really have to figure something else out. And basically what they figured out under Melvin Laird was, let's just kick the can down the road. You know,
Okay.
the problem is unsolvable.
Okay.
So that's where strategic arms limitations really started trying to get done. And if Jimmy could have pulled off SALT II, things would have been a lot better, much sooner. But it didn't happen.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we will to get to this question then.
Mm-hmm.
When and why did Ronald Reagan promote this project, the arms race called Star Wars by the critics, officially called Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI?
Yes. Well,
Okay.
there's a couple of reasons going in there. More than a couple, but okay. Here's the problem. Reagan comes in and he said, "Well, we have this window of vulnerability with the Russians. They're far ahead of us in everything right now. We have a missile gap. We have an atomic bomb gap. Their land forces are far superior to ours. We need a major military buildup." And I can still remember.
That's what he said publicly.
Yeah. Cap Weinberger going to Congress and say, "Well, I need to bring back the battleships. We have the 4 battleships and mothballs, and he wants to bring them out as part of the fleet." And you're wondering, what can a battleship do? It can fire a shell 20 miles, but that's it. I mean, shore bombardment, but what's the point of it?
Well, he could sell stuff from Bechtel.
Well, we can put cruise missiles on it. There'll be cruise missile platforms out there. There'll be hundreds of miles offshore. And I'm thinking, oh, good God, they're the biggest target in the world. And the Falkland War really proved anything between when Britain and Argentina fought over some worthless islands in the middle of nowhere, the South Atlantic, that surface warships are extremely vulnerable to missile attack.
Yeah.
They lost a lot of their ships.
Right.
And they also proved something else, that battleships can be sunk by one torpedo from a submarine.
Yeah.
Which they did. They sunk the General Belgrano, which was an old British battleship that they sold to Argentina. And they sunk it with one shot, and they killed almost everybody on board. I mean, it's just like that. It was gone.
Yeah.
Well, anybody can afford a submarine, and a torpedo doesn't cost that much. And there's no battleship in the world that can't be sunk by one torpedo.
Yeah.
It's easy to do. Well, anyway, so he's this major arms buildup going on. And this is where Edward Teller comes in, and back again. Edward Teller comes in, and he has the president's ear. He says, "Okay, this is what we need to put nuclear weapons in space. That's where we need to put them because they're invincible and vulnerable up there. They can't be brought down. They'll always be orbiting, and you can drop them at like that. And of course, that'll make the Russians fear us, and they'll withdraw from Hungary, and the Hungarians will have their freedom, and so on." Well, the problem is there's a treaty out there. Okay, remember the strategic, the
ABM?
not the ABM, but the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty.
Yeah.
It outlawed nuclear weapons in space.
Yeah.
And Reagan could never accept that. He couldn't figure out how could that be. Well, there it is. It's a ratified treaty. You can't put a nuclear weapon in there. So all this thing about Star Wars, which came out when that movie came out, to having space weapons. How can I put nuclear weapons in space and not call them a nuclear weapon? And that was where, okay, we'll put other devices in space that will be able to intercept. Now, see this. Now, this is where we're getting into it. It's not an offensive weapon; it's a defensive weapon. Their missiles won't be able to get through our missiles in space.
Yeah.
And they will be powered by nuclear weapons. So they had this concept that Teller was really pushing. You would take a hydrogen bomb, and it would be in orbit, and it would be connected to a device that produced X-rays.
Yeah.
And it's called an X-laser. It's a laser beam, but instead of using visible light of the electromagnetic spectrum, it now uses X-rays on the extreme end of the spectrum. But to make an X laser, you have to have a nuclear device generate the X-rays.
Yeah.
So you would fire off this nuclear weapon, which would then focus its X-rays down the laser.
Yeah.
And by the way, this whole thing is self-destructive. You only use it once. So that hits those X-rays then hits the missile that's coming in at the speed of light. Well, anything hit by that massive amount of X-rays will just simply be fried. It'll just internally it'll just melt. So the missile may come back to Earth, but it's just going to be a piece of lead. It's it'll be like a rock. It'll fall, and that'll be the end of it. And that was the whole idea of that. Well, to do this, you pretty much had to gut the whole NASA budget to figure out ways of getting this stuff into orbit and how to fly it. And they were really pushing on it, and they had other ideas up there. They would put devices that wouldn't even shoot an explosive. It would just be a piece of metal, like a shotgun. You would just simply fire it, and the projectile would then hit its target and go through it and knock it out. And they thought this was really a great idea. This is really going to work. Of course, you would need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these things up there, and they'd be always up in orbit. You'd have to somehow maintain them and keep them running, and they just thought this was just a great idea. Now, as a sidebar, one of the people that they brought in to convince Reagan that this would all work was a science fiction writer, a guy named Jerry Pernelli, who is a far right winger. He's a survivalist, writes all kinds of science fiction about, we're the last people left on Earth and we have to fight and survive, and and we'll do anything to do it, to show how, from a science fiction point of view, how all this was possible. And apparently Reagan went for it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, they were just throwing money into this, all this research and so on, to figure out how to do this. But the thing that kept coming up was, you can't put that bomb in orbit. You can't do it because it's going to violate the treaty. Well, they just finally figured out, well, we won't tell anybody. We'll just put them up there, but no one has to know. And then they're going, well, I bet the Russians have them up there right now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have to stop. We're talking about Ronald Reagan and the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, which wasn't strategic. And it wasn't defensive.
No.
It was an initiative.
No. Well.
But it never got off the ground.
No.
He started it.
He started it. I know they put some test devices in orbit. They did things like, they kept having to pare it back. Reagan, remember one thing, he was elected as a Republican, and Republicans are supposed to be stingy, conservative in terms of the budget and so on. And they were looking, he had already had these huge conventional weapons budgets passed. Now we're brought these the battleships back. We were expanding we now had the B-2 bomber, supersonic, and all these huge expensive weapon systems that are coming online. Star Wars was just beyond anything any nation could afford.
Yeah.
And so they had to start paring it back. And then they started figuring out, well, what can we do in space that would give us an initiative? Well, if we could blow up their satellites, if we could cut the Russian satellites off, that would be a great thing. So they were experimenting with killer satellites.
Right.
Well, so they were doing some tests there, and then they found out, okay, well, we have this satellite here, and we'll bring this satellite over here, and then we'll blow this satellite up, and that'll blow this satellite up. But when you do that, now you've thrown all this stuff out that's going at, thousands and thousands of miles an hour, and it's hitting everybody else's satellites. So that wasn't working out very well.
Yeah, well, okay.
See, there's cause and effect, there's problems.
That's true.
It's just never as simple as you think it is.
No, well, of course, I didn't believe it when I first heard of it, and all of the physicists at Harvard and Yale and Berkeley and even at Ohio University were saying, well, it would never work. And they were signing petitions, you know. Everybody in the physics department say, sign this petition. Say, Star Wars can't work.
Yeah, well,
and common sense would tell you, how can I take a rifle and shoot at a cannonball and knock the cannonball? No. Ordinary farmers are not going to believe this.
Even if you could, the expense is just so astronomical.
And then they talked about the defense. They had these cellophane tin that would deflect the laser beam. Did you hear about that?
Yeah.
Put those up in space and they'd go in six different directions.
Yeah, you had these huge antennas.
That was a defense.
That's all defense.
Well, the defense seemed to be...
I don't think the Russians really took it as much as a defensive move, as more of a...
Well, I guess they didn't have the computers anyway. They had to sign this treaty. Mm-hmm. The Russians were behind in computers.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why Gorbachev just threw the towel in. Mm-hmm. I mean, he said, okay, we can't keep up. We're spending 25% of our GNP on the arms race.
Yeah.
The United States, even with all of this stuff, was only spending 6%.
Yeah.
So we'll never catch up.
Because not that rate. No.
So anyway, I think you've said enough about that.
Yeah.
So I don't have to say any more about, except Edward Teller. I didn't have a little facts of what I know about Edward Teller. Edward Teller came up with this idea in 1979, and he apparently must have convinced Caspar Weinberg. That's still secret as far as I know. Who sold this to Ronald Reagan? Was it Teller himself, or did it go through Weinberger? That's somewhat a mystery. Anyway, I don't have any answer to that.
I don't either. But the problem was Reagan wasn't qualified to really understand that.
Yeah, much of anything.
Yeah.
Right. But Weinberger must have signed on to Teller's stuff as the.
Well, Secretary of Defense, he'd had to.
Yeah, he must have signed on. I think that Weinberger's idea as well. It might work. Let's try it as it might work.
It might work. Why not?
So anyway. I think we might get on to the next big bombshell, which that this laser beam thing led to a Soviet reaction, and this problem of Reagan's theology. Apparently, he launched this stuff all very soon. In other words, in November of '83. No, in May. Let me get the dates here. Yeah, in November of '83, the Soviets had the panic. But back in May, Reagan goes to Orlando, Florida, and talks about the Empire of Evil.
Yeah,
that was
the evil empire.
Yeah, that was only in 2 weeks after he launched the Star Wars.
That's right. Well, don't forget the evil empire term also comes out of that movie, Star Wars. See,
I see.
I mean, Reagan is living in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Okay. He's president of the United States, but he's still in a movie.
Right.
You know, and so all his analogies and symbolism is coming from a science fiction movie.
Right.
So. Yeah, the evil empire was one of the things that the good guys in the movie were fighting against.
Right.
Okay, well, America must be the good guys, right?
Right.
Because we wouldn't be the bad guys. We're making this movie, so the Russians must be the evil empire.
Right.
Okay, so I could see why the Russians would start getting a little nervous about this guy.
Right.
That and the fact that Cap Weinberger has already went to Congress and said we need this major military buildup. We have to station new intermediate range missiles in Europe. We need these, what were they called? Sergeant? No.
Honest John?
Honest Johns, yeah. The Honest John missiles, ones and twos. And there's this big thing. Are we going to put them in Germany? Are we going to put them in Holland or Italy? We're surrounding them again with these intermediate range missiles, and you're wondering, what is the point of those missiles being there? It makes no sense.
Yeah.
And then they were arguing. The Russians had this huge tank army. We need some way of just killing the men inside and not destroying the countryside.
The neutron bomb.
The neutron bomb, so the Europeans will like it better. It won't destroy their countryside. It'll just kill all the people in it. So what's not to like about it? It's a great idea. So yeah.
Well, I guess the Germans shot that down.
Well,
your strategic weapon, no, your so-called tactical weapon is a strategic weapon as far as Germany is concerned.
They went to
get your vocabulary straight.
So.
Okay, so okay, do you want to get to this memo here?
The Able Archer?
Yeah,
okay,
this thing, how did the Soviet leadership in November of '83, what does this memo teach us about the panic in Washington?
Well, okay, what this thing here is a declassified summary of a report that was commissioned by the Department of Defense to figure out if indeed the Soviet hierarchy was panicked by an annual war game that NATO does every November, or had done, which was called Able Archer.
Right.
And Able Archer goes, it has different scenarios, but in 1983, in November, the scenario was the Soviet Union has launched a surprise attack of a conventional kind against NATO through Germany. They go through the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and they're going through Germany, and we're caught off guard. And how do we respond to this? So the war game, which the exercise involved planners and all the NATO headquarters in the Pentagon, Washington and Germany and so on. And there were troop maneuvers. We were, moving our NATO troops around. You know how it is in Europe. You move your tanks from this town to that town and so on. They were.
This was mostly naval, wasn't it?
Able Archer?
Yeah.
No. It was.
Across the board.
Across the board. Yeah. This was.
Going to be land, air, and naval.
Yeah. How does the NATO allies respond to a conventional, at the moment, conventional Soviet attack against Western Europe? And they did this ever since the 50s.
Right.
Okay. Well, the context now has changed a lot, because now the rhetoric in Washington has really ramped up.
Right.
We need Star Wars. We have an evil empire. America has to rebuild. We got to rearm. We got to do this. And we're talking and talking and talking against the Soviets in a tone that we haven't done since the 1960s. Since the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably, that we'd ever actively pointed at the Soviet Union and said, you are the source of all evil in the world, and it's time we did something about it.
Yeah.
And so, okay, that's the context. But what happened was the Russian hierarchy is in shambles. This is not the Soviet Union of Nikita Khrushchev of 1960, or the Soviet Union of Brezhnev and Kosygin of 1967-68. Leonid Brezhnev has died.
Right.
Okay. He had been there for practically forever.
20 years, anyway.
Brezhnev...
From 64 to 82.
To 82. But on top of that, he was one of these type of guys. He was a survivor of the purges of Stalin.
Right.
He was a middle functionary, but he got through them. He got through the Second World War. He got through Khrushchev as one of Khrushchev's right-hand man. Right. And then led a coup to overthrow Khrushchev.
Right.
So he was very well respected, and he was a stable person. Now, he was no intellect. He was no
bureaucrat.
He was a bureaucrat. He was
stand pat bureaucrat.
Yeah, that's
Stalin forever.
He was the kind of guy that would work, I don't know, say in a county courthouse, counting the dog tags.
Right.
He was that type of person.
One of these bean counters.
Yeah. but he was stable, and he was in charge. Well, now he's dead.
Yeah.
They bring in, the new person that comes in was Andrei Andropov, who was the former KGB director.
Yeah, and he was rather old.
Rather old, like all of them. They're not. There's no young men here. You know,
Yeah.
they've all aged. They're that generation that rose up together. They helped each other. They're all sort of friends. You know. Well, anyway. But anyway, now Andropov is in charge. But Andropov has renal failure. He's dying.
Yeah.
Okay, and he's just basically hospitalized, and it's the Kremlin then is disorganized. There's no who do we go to. So that's their context that they're looking at this. So who's in charge? Well, you have the marshals of the Soviet Union, the military, and they're looking at what's going on. They're reading the tea leaves. They're looking at their reports from their spies and stuff, and they're going, you know, I think, by God, they're going to, this war game exercise is nothing but a cover for them to mobilize. They're mobilizing. We know their troops are on the move. We know their bombers are in their air. Their submarines, all their submarines are now out to sea.
Right.
So there must be something going on here. And they're going, I bet they're going to attack us. They're really thinking, by God, they are going to hit us. And so they're watching what the Americans are doing. And each day, we ramp it up a little more, you know, and something else we put in the mix. Okay, now put another aircraft carrier out to sea. Have it stand off here. And so this is just going on. They're watching it. Their spies are coming back and they're saying, we really don't know what's going on. You know, we don't know one way or the other. So that's one of the problems. Now the Americans, in the meantime, like we've always done with NATO, we have this agreement. If you're going to do a war exercise, let us know. And we've always agreed with that. So we're telling, it's just, this. Oh, by the way, though, we're going to do something a little different this time than we've never done before. We're going to have the President of the United States directly involved. He will make the decision whether to launch the nuclear missiles or not. And that was the first time that's ever been done. And every military exercise that ever been done, it never went to the White House. It always stayed with the lower level guys. Well, that just, okay, yeah. They were now convinced, at least a majority of them, that, well, if the President of the United States is involved with it, then they're going to launch a surprise attack.
Yeah.
They're going to do it.
Right.
So they start mobilizing.
Right.
We didn't know it because we're so involved, but now they are going up several steps of readiness. They're putting their bombers, their missiles, and everything up on the, up to a higher level. Well, okay. Well,
yeah, there was a 2-day affair.
Yeah.
I got here at 29th, 30th of October, 1983. Mm-hmm. Washington Post published this article.
Yeah.
And now this is where I got the naval idea. They had 80% of the fleet out.
Yeah.
British fleet, French fleet, Dutch fleet, Italian fleet,
Yep.
Norwegian fleet, Portuguese fleet, and Turkish fleet. Mm-hmm. 102 vessels or something.
Yep. Yeah, we had them surrounded. So
if I had another life to live, I would call my new book "Speed Kills." Whether you're driving an automobile, running a computer, flying an aircraft, or these young students with their social media.
Yeah.
They can write a paragraph faster than I can write a book, but they don't know what the paragraph said.
Right. Yeah, well, it says here, Able Archer was conducted every year and routinely monitored by Soviet intelligence, quote unquote. But the November '83 version had new procedures, quote, which we believe probably fueled the Soviet, anxieties. The review found NATO tested new communications methods with a more graduated escalation. The Able Archer also used live mobilization exercises from U.S. military forces in Europe. All this may have looked more realistic to Soviet spies who were watching. Both the KGB and Soviet military intelligence were ordered on November the 8th or 9th to report on increased alert at U.S. bases in Europe, which they did. Warsaw Pact also launched an unprecedented reconnaissance effort, including 36 intelligence flights.
Right.
That was never seen before. Then the Warsaw Pact imposed a suspension of all military flight operations between November the 4th and 10th, except for the intelligence flights, probably to make available as many aircraft as possible for combat.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were taking this really serious. Well, okay, so, we get through it.
Well, we got a defector here. This guy,
Yes.
Oleg
Mm-hmm.
Gordievsky. I guess he confirmed that the NSA, the American National Security Agency, in 1990, did crack their spy, and it was true.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of annoyed Reagan.
Right. well, two things were happening there. The Soviet spies at NATO were coming back with information that to them would indicate this was not a cover for a sneak attack.
Right.
And they were trying to filter that back up to the Kremlin. And then, on the other hand, the United States spies were coming back and saying, guys, they're taking this very serious. We've got to do something to de-escalate this. So one of the things that they did was at the last minute, they went to the president and said, okay, we're going to cut the White House out.
Right.
They're not going to be part of this exercise.
Right.
So that may have lessened the tension right there.
Right.
But in the end, I think what really helped more than anything else was the cooler heads in the Kremlin said, look, if they're going to launch an attack, we'll have to wait and see. We're
Right.
not going to preempt this. We just can't take the chance.
Right.
Well, I think the significance of all this is that this report was prepared later and given to Reagan to read.
Yeah.
And I think that's when the Hollywood bubble finally burst. I think that's when after the report is written and he reads it, that's when we see the Reagan administration starting to back away from the Star Wars thing.
Okay.
Yeah, probably because of cost and other things. But now they're saying, I think we better pursue disarmament. Let's talk to it. Well, of course, by that time, Andropov is dead. And now we have the Chernenko comes in, who's only there just a few months, and then he dies. And finally, Gorbachev comes along, who is a much younger generation.
52 years old.
And he's anxious
Right.
for talks, negotiations.
Sure.
And he is very willing to listen to Reagan. Now, of course, he doesn't do everything that he probably could have done, but...
Well, I think he played his cards well.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I think he played the best game he could with the cards he had in his hand. But I really think that it was Abel Archer, the aftermath, and the fact that, you almost, Mr. President, pushed the Russians into a point where they actually believed your rhetoric when you said that they really need to be taken out.
Right.
And I think that the problem was that at that point Reagan and everybody else, we were believing our own propaganda.
Right.
We were saying, oh no, we'll never.
Well, that was the problem.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the truth and propaganda? Reagan is an actor, and as you say, he mixed his lines up sometime from one movie to the other.
Yeah. But I think it.
So you think it's the road to Reykjavik?
That's what I think it was the beginning of the fact that we've pushed him as far as we can go. We almost caused a nuclear holocaust.
Right.
Let's step back from this.
Well, it's my understanding that Reagan met Gorbachev 4 times.
Yeah.
And he met the first time in Geneva, and they just got to know one another as human beings.
Right.
And the second time. So I think it was the 3rd time that they go to Reykjavik.
Right. I think one thing that helped in all that was Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
Now, of course, Reagan loved Margaret Thatcher. She was the Tory conservative who came to power in Great Britain. I mean, she led Britain against Argentina and won the Falklands War. Very staunch conservative, and she met Gorbachev.
Well, Gorbachev went to London.
Yeah,
that was a good play on his part.
And they talked. And she had that news conference, and she said, I like Mr. Gorbachev.
We can do business.
We can do business. I remember the sheer hell that the conservative press in America, they just blew up. I mean, William F. Buckley thought that was, we have been betrayed. Betrayed. They're talking, said we can deal with the communists. This is just terrible. Like just foaming at the mouth. And here's poor old Ronnie, she's my hero. We really like each other. And,
right.
And I've always trusted her opinion up to now.
Yeah.
Well, maybe she's onto something,
Yeah. That was in '85.
Yeah, so I think that really helped matters a lot.
Sure.
And so when he was not...
Yeah, it was a couple of years from 83 to 86, and 85 was a decisive turning point.
It was.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think Thatcher had a lot to do with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how we got enough time. Well, we can at least, we got a couple more minutes.
Okay, yeah.
So what is your analysis and your understanding of what happened at Reykjavik? What did they say? And it's interesting that they met in Iceland, halfway between Moscow and New York. And it was only a 2-day meeting, 11th and 12th of October, 1986. And then in 1987, the press reports that Caspar Weinberger resigns, supposedly over the Iran-Contra scandal, but maybe he resigned as a result of the 86 meeting because supposedly Weinberger and Schultz both were suspicious of Ronald Reagan's quick agreement.
Yes.
Robert, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, so I guess we've just set the stage here.
Yeah, we'll set the stage for that one. Yeah.
And we'll have to continue this next time.
Yeah.
And as I say many times before, we have to keep debate going. Debate is the oxygen of democracy. And we got to keep debating the nuclear arms race because...
well, we still have them.
Yeah, well, the arms are related to politics, and they're related to religion, and they're related to economics. And most people can't put the 4 boxes together. So thank you for coming.
Pleasure.